we begin presenting fascinating developments related to the field of physics in this segment, we're really compelled to update you on the continuous flood of astonishing academic fraud scandals hitting higher education institutions. Simply put, the explosion of retractions of published scientific papers continued to grow at an exponential rate as 2023 came to an end. By the end of 2023, the number of published scientific papers rubber-stamped by peer review committees and published in seemingly prestigious academic journals doubled versus 2022. And the number of additional retractions has continued unabated in 2024. In fact, in early 2024, there was yet another bombshell that went off regarding bogus published scientific papers at Harvard University. Aside from Harvard University's president Claudine Gay and her much more well-publicized resignation over charges of plagiarism early in 2024, the most recent fraud scandal erupted at Harvard's Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. In January of 2024, Harvard lost even more of what is left of its scientific credibility when dozens of published scientific papers on cancer research, which had all passed traditional peer reviews at Harvard, once again came under fundamental scrutiny by independent investigators. As we went into production for this segment, many of these papers in question had already been retracted, and many others had been corrected with the investigations continuing. In part 2, we suggested these scandals and peer reviews, in combination with the publish or perish model, are not isolated incidents. Instead, they are part of an obvious pattern that involves fatally flawed incentive structures that are producing widespread cheating at previously highly regarded institutions of higher learning like Harvard and Stanford. Independent science investigators such as Dr. Elizabeth Bick, Dr. Leif Nelson, Dr. Yuri Simonson, Dr. Joe Simmons, and Dr. John Carlisle are part of a growing list of 21st century scientific reformers that we highlighted in part 2. These scientists are very busy these days simply because, in a very real sense, they seem to understand the dawn of the long-awaited scientific reformation is finally upon us. And as these diligent scientists, and many others like them, strive to hold the ruling scientific hierarchy accountable at institutions like Harvard, Stanford, and many other well-heeled universities, those at the very top of the science pyramid continue to insist their bureaucracies are still the exclusive, trusted gatekeepers of scientific truth. And in doing so, they're displaying the same behaviors that Pope Leo X and the College of Cardinals did more than 600 years ago. We encourage you to investigate these scandals for yourself. Let's briefly return to Albert Einstein's response to a sixth grader named Phyllis Wright, who wrote him a letter back in 1936 to ask him if scientists pray. His response remains at the very heart of the findings in this documentary. Everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that some spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, one that is vastly superior to that of man. Now, the letter Einstein wrote was found in his personal papers after his death, and the letter was later auctioned off by a collector, or off to a collector, by Sotheby's, a major art auction company. The key excerpt of Einstein's response to Phyllis Wright applies directly to the issues that have produced a complete lack of progress in origin of life research in biology labs. The revelation of Einstein's assertion shines an even brighter light on the difficulties of answering the great question in the wake of laboratory proofs of quantum entanglement, which is the main topic of this segment. It is important to recognize that in Einstein's answer to young Phyllis Wright, he was not referring to the elegantly complex properties of the coding in DNA. His statement was simply a candid intellectual admission based on the baffling mysteries associated with quantum entanglement. Einstein was essentially suggesting that all of mankind, including himself, did not know many things about the laws of the universe, thanks to a governing spirit that was superior. Now, while Einstein did not mention quantum entanglement as being at the heart of the mystery, it was at this stage of his own career in the field of particle physics that he was unable to reconcile the baffling complexities he was encountering. And as we will see, as we pursue the basic evidence in particle physics, these mysteries remain to this very day. It is critical to remember that this intellectual gauntlet was thrown down by a genius. Einstein remains a scientist who is still thought of as perhaps someone who had greater insights into reality and the nature of scientific pursuit than any other scientist who ever lived. We can easily get into the high weeds on the topic of particle physics, especially given the recent developments in the field that has proven that quantum entanglement is both mysterious and real. While the implications of the latest updates to mankind's understanding of particle physics have been helpful in terms of advancing quantum computing technologies as well as encryption techniques, the latest Nobel Prize winning efforts in physics also serve as glaring illustrations of the validity of Einstein's declaration about some spirit being manifest in the laws of the universe that is superior to that of man. And even more importantly, it has become increasingly obvious to many scientists that this has become a turning point in scientific history. Since the latest developments in particle physics are critical to efforts to answer the great question, we will dive just a bit deeper. The front edge of this turning point in physics began to resurface nearly 60 years ago with the mind-boggling mathematical proofs of Dr. John Stuart Bell. Bell discovered through brilliant mathematical processes that the laws of the universe allow for a single quantum system to be divided up into parts that are separated from each other, but still act as a single unit. In the 60s, this was merely a mathematical theory that went against all the generally accepted ideas regarding cause and effect, and accordingly, the nature of reality. Let's read the case made by doubters of Bell's mathematical proof. How could something come under the influence of an event occurring somewhere else without being reached by some form of signal from that event? It is important to understand that Dr. Bell was a theoretical physicist rather than a scientist who worked in a lab. His proofs were mathematical. His work suggested that while a signal cannot travel faster than the speed of light at the quantum level, there is no need for a signal to connect the different parts of an extended system because they're already connected, regardless of space or time. Okay, that's far enough into the weeds. The best layman's explanation for Dr. Bell's work is very simple. And this explanation applies directly to the answer to the great question. There has now been a mysterious cause and effect associated with tiny little quantum systems that has been scientifically proven in the labs by Nobel Prize winning scientists in the 21st century. They indicate properties of the laws of the universe are superior to that which man can understand. Now let me rephrase this for emphasis. These are findings that are consistent with some spirit manifest in the laws of the universe that are superior to that of man. While mankind can use these latest discoveries in quantum entanglement to advance quantum computing, encryption technologies, at the teeny tiny quantum level, even the most articulate and brilliant scientists of today are completely unable to explain why this is so. The interesting thing about this development in physics is how widespread the utter confusion remains among the great physics experts of the 21st century concerning why quantum entanglement is real. And it was a great relief to me after studying the reasons given by the Nobel Committee in its awarding of the 2022 Prize for Physics that I was not the only one who remained mystified and baffled. For an illustration of how baffling this discovery remains, let's read the reactions of a few people who work in the field of physics before we tie together all the points in this discussion. We will start with Dr. Don Lincoln. Don Lincoln is a world-renowned physicist, and he is also a terrific teacher. He has impeccable scientific credentials. Lincoln tells the following story about a question he received from a listener after making a presentation. Lincoln says he was asked, quote, "What is the weirdest physics phenomenon that you have ever learned about?" Now, Lincoln said he could not recall what his answer was, but he did say, quote, "I should have told her about a thing called quantum entanglement. It still blows my mind," end of quote. That's amazing. The next quote, indicating astonishment again, comes from Dr. Olivia Lanes. Now, Dr. Lanes works at IBM Quantum. Dr. Lanes posted a video in 2022 to help explain what the Nobel Prize winning laboratory proofs of quantum entanglement mean. Here is a direct quote from Dr. Lanes' video. Quote, "So it's not just weird on paper, it's weird in the real world. Quantum mechanics brings us to the brink of the impossible, and it brings us to the point at which we shouldn't be able to fully comprehend what is going on. Not only did these three scientists show that quantum mechanics is weird and mysterious and counterintuitive, it is practical. These experiments showed for the first time that entanglement really is something that is so fundamentally different than classical physics can describe," end of quote. Now, Dr. Lane's own mind seems to be blown away, just as Dr. Lincoln's was. Let's check out Dr. David Kipping's equally amazing befuddlement. Dr. Kipping is an astrophysicist at Columbia University. Dr. Kipping provides multiple assists to our efforts to illustrate what is going on in higher education by inadvertently allowing his personal philosophies to become part of the discussion in his perplexed reaction to quantum entanglement. In a video he made for his students, Dr. Kipping expressed deep disappointment that scientists have not been able to unlock the intricate mysteries of quantum entanglement so it can be used in faster than the speed of light communications to assist in interstellar travel. Here is a direct quote of what he had to say. Quote, "There is a sense we are glimpsing some deeper truth here. I know this is not the answer that either you or I was hoping for. Trust me, I know. But just like with our own lives, praying for a miracle, like winning the lottery, or hoping that your problems will just magically disappear one day, doesn't serve as a productive path to making future progress. At a certain point, you just have to accept the hand you have been dealt and try to make the best of it." End of quote. Now, it was quite telling in this direct quote that not only did Dr. Kipping seem to understand that a deeper truth is at work here, he also felt compelled, almost desperately, to offer his personal philosophy to his students on day-to-day life, prayers, and the tricky concept of miracles. It seems clear from his video that Dr. Kipping was completely unaware of what Albert Einstein had already asserted regarding these mysteries and the laws of the universe all the way back in 1936. But still, to make sure his students knew what his personal theological philosophy was, just in case they might drift towards a personal philosophy that differed from his, Dr. Kipping made sure he did what he could to convince his students that the practice of prayer, quote, doesn't serve as a productive path to making future progress. Now, perhaps Dr. Kipping understood that a common definition of quantum teleportation, which is actually the information transfer, this part of the great mystery of quantum entanglement, is this: a very mysterious transfer of information without the limitations of space or time by entangled particles that is baffling scientists around the world. It is establishing brand new frontiers for particle physicists to study. And it seems ironic, but hardly coincidental, that quantum teleportation, which is the property of quantum entanglement that sends this mysterious signal, could also be described in the same way that theologists define the ways that prayer works. The statement by Dr. Kipping is quite telling, in that he admitted he was disappointed because both he and his students were hoping for a different outcome. Now, hoping for the finding of facts to be different tends to indicate bias towards a desired outcome, as do his words. Kipping openly admits he desperately wanted these mysterious signals to be a way for systems designed by human beings to engage in interstellar communications. However, his disappointment was so complete, he went so far as to volunteer his personal philosophy on miracles, prayer, and day-to-day life to his students, just in case some of these students were sensing some spirit superior to man is present in all this. Dr. Kipping did so without conceding this might actually be the glimpse of a deeper truth that he had already indicated he was sensing. Now, the point in reviewing quotes from these three well-known 21st century scientists is simple. If you've never been exposed to the statements made by Einstein regarding some spirit in the laws of the universe, and yet as a scientist you willingly concede your mind is blown, in effect you are admitting you have found yourself in the same position that Einstein and Newton were as their lives ended, as they kept encountering some spirit manifest in the laws of the universe. Dr. Robert Jastrow tied a nice, neat bow on all this intellectual contortionism that is worth considering. He was the very first chairman of NASA's Lunar Exploration Committee. He provided crucial service to the space program in terms of defining the scientific goals and the objectives of the lunar landing. Jastrow said this, quote, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith and the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." Now, in the wake of reading Dr. Jastrow's views on these ongoing mysteries associated with the known laws of physics, it is important to understand what we are seeing and what we are hearing. From a historical perspective, there is simply a new bureaucratic sheriff in town. However, there's not much in the way of new science and physics since the days of Einstein on answering the great question. Centuries ago, colleges and universities around the world were originally founded and funded to operate primarily as theological enterprises. The primary mission of colonial era colleges in America was to train members of the Christian clergy. This era gradually ended. Eventually, a majority of academic institutions had undergone stark changes, especially in institutional philosophies by the start of the 20th century. And eventually, every vestige of philosophy associated with the previous era, dominated by theologians, was erased from the approved curriculums at all publicly funded higher education institutions and many private ones as well. Now, unfortunately, over the last 100 years or more, several generations of students have been taught the known laws of the universe with no mention whatsoever of Albert Einstein's declaration about some spirit being manifest in the laws of the universe that is superior to that of man. This is a self-serving, all or none mentality that is clearly philosophical in nature, not scientific. And as the evidence unfolds, it is clear that clinging to this philosophy has painted science bureaucrats into a corner. If a philosophical opinion is mandatory, it's not an opinion. It is literally a mandate. And while those who insist on micromanaging how science is taught to students have been dictating, they have also been presiding over publish or perish and peer review models that have been feeding fraudulent claims regarding origin of life research to science teachers for 7 decades. What this all means is simple for students around the world. Well-educated teachers with common sense are being denied intellectual freedom to think for themselves and tell the whole story in their classrooms. These are freedoms that were never denied Newton or Einstein when they made their astonishing discoveries that changed the world. The great discoveries by Newton and Einstein came while they were completely outside the influence of ruling scientific bureaucracy hierarchies. So here we are, nearly a quarter of the way through the 21st century, and any teacher who contradicts even the most fraudulent claims on DNA, which completely ignore basic mathematics, has been deemed to have engaged in conduct that is grounds for termination by those at the top of the ruling hierarchy of the scientific pyramid. And yet the students that these bullied teachers will influence, who are sure to carry the torch of science into the future, must exit higher education without the benefit of insights held by the titans of science like Einstein and Newton. As for the next generation of scientists, attempts to move closer to the answer to the great question means they deserve better than to continuously fall under the domination of a self-serving bureaucracy or bureaucracies who have been focused on overhauling, who should be focused instead on overhauling their antiquated publish or perish and peer review models that are producing copious amounts of academic fraud. A review of the great body of evidence suggests a very direct connection between these two seemingly separate findings simply because it fits the rest of the evidence. The connection is the mysterious existence and properties of information. Physicists have admitted they have no idea why quantum entanglement is real. Dr. Don Lincoln said it best when he said, "It still blows my mind." The pattern has been established, and information is once again the common sticking point, as it has been all along with the information coding in DNA. Information in DNA and its transfer in quantum teleportation is the critical common denominator ripe for scientific investigation. Is it mere coincidence that we cannot explain the intricacies of information as they apply to both DNA and quantum entanglement? It's possible. This is merely a coincidence, could be a possibility. If so, it certainly is a curious one that requires extensive scientific investigation. Scientific progress faces two impasses now that are going to require scientific reformation. One impasse involves a how, and the other impasse involves a why. First, how did the elaborate digital information coding in DNA get there? Because it didn't write itself. Second, why are entangled particles able to transfer signals or information to one another without regards to space or time? Sometimes science stumbles upon amazing discoveries. Penicillin was a profoundly important development for both medical science and society. Penicillin was essentially a discovery that was stumbled upon. Alexander Fleming was not sure of what it meant when he discovered in his petri dish that it had mold in it, along with dead microbes spanning outward from the borders of the mold. It took a few years for the scientific community to even begin to understand the meaning of the brief paper Fleming wrote on what happened in his petri dish. Theologians often describe the properties of prayer as a mysterious information transfer irrespective of space or time. This turns out to be a very similar definition to the great mysteries that quantum entanglement represents. Here's the point. Great scientists like Newton and Einstein were capable of brilliance in terms of unraveling mysteries. They did so without bureaucrats imposing limits on their lines of thinking. Part of what unleashed the greatness in Newton and again in Einstein was they were free to think for themselves and speak their minds. Yesterday's mysteries are more often today's and tomorrow's scientific breakthroughs, as evidenced in the way that penicillin was developed. Nothing seems clearer than the fact that the definition of miracles is constantly evolving. It's hard to imagine anyone thinking when it happened that the mold found in Alexander Fleming's petri dish would lead to the discovery of penicillin, followed by the development of various antibiotics capable of eliminating life-ending infections. Stumbling upon insights that then become part of reality is integral to the game of advancing the cause of science. Considering the reality that ruling bureaucracies in the field of science have been purposely ignoring the mathematics associated with the elegant code contained in DNA, it should not be surprising that they have also remained conspicuously silent regarding the torrent of fraudulent papers being published at places like Harvard, Stanford, and many other institutions that they tend to collaborate with. Let's harken back to the great Mahatma Gandhi and relate what he said about the small number of British administrators who were dominating hundreds of millions of people in India. Quote, "Even if you are a minority of one, the truth is still the truth." An interesting question would be this one. Given the policy-making realities implied by pyramid-like shapes of the ruling hierarchy and its fatally flawed peer review and publish or perish models, is it time to recognize it is not much different than the basis for British rule in India prior to independence? We all know what happened eventually to British rule in India. One final question comes to the surface. When will the same tactics employed by Gandhi and many others to right egregious wrongs, which includes organized non-cooperation with the ruling authorities, become integral to calls for intellectual freedom made by those employed as classroom teachers at all levels? History suggests this is inevitable simply because it is the only way to put an end to the intellectual charades that include withheld evidence, an absence of mathematical proofs, and an avalanche of scandals triggered by fatally flawed policies that govern the publish or perish and peer review models.